Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. I hope you enjoyed our first lecture in macroeconomics. I hope you didn't find the stuff too difficult. I threw a lot of stuff at you in our first lecture, but this is what macroeconomics is about. Because we are talking about the macroeconomy, there are a number of macro variables that we need to understand together. The problem with macroeconomics when you compare it with microeconomics is that you cannot understand macroeconomics in pieces. Now in microeconomics, you might recall we separated discussion between demand and supply, elasticities, market structures, etc., etc. And you could understand pretty much those different segments separately. In macroeconomics, this is not a possibility. If you want to really understand inflation, for example, that is the rate of change in prices, you need to understand the fiscal side of government. You need to understand employment. You need to understand balance of payments. So all of these macro variables are interrelated. So sometimes in the start when you are studying macroeconomics, you feel that suddenly everything is clear to you, but the next moment one link of the chain sort of breaks and you feel that you know nothing. So this is a possibility in the early period when you're studying or starting out with macroeconomics. But my advice would be patient. Try to assimilate what you can. Go through stuff that confuses you, and then eventually, I hope, it will all come together. Now for this reason, and for other reasons, I have decided to go much more slowly today so that you are able to absorb the language, the concepts that I am throwing at you. The reason I am teaching you macroeconomics, I taught you micro in English as well, but the reason I want to persist with the English language is that there is no point in being able to understand macroeconomic concepts and then not being able to articulate it in the language of the subject. So if you understand what causes unemployment, then it's worth the while to know the language which you can use to express your understanding. So economic issues, even if you understand them fully, require a good or a decent knowledge or command of the English language for you to be able to express it. Now I'm not saying that some of you who might be better at English than others would naturally excel in economics or would do better in economics. No, economics is very concept intensive. As you know, there are a lot of graphs, slides, equations. There is a lot of concepts that we have covered and that we will continue to cover. But the important thing is that you have to combine the content, the analytical content, with the language in order to produce good economic analysis, good economics essays. So keep that thing in mind. With that, we start today's lecture. Let's start by looking at what we covered in our previous lecture. Now, if you remember, we started our previous lecture by defining macroeconomics as the study of the economy as a whole. We gave the example of looking at a race of athletes either through a set of binoculars or through the naked eye. If you look at the race through the pair of binoculars, then there are chances that you will be better able to focus on any individual athlete in the race, that is, any individual runner. And we gave the example of microeconomics, that this was like looking at any individual market in the whole of the economy. That is, whether you were focusing on the labor market or whether you were focusing on the market for tobacco, the market for bananas, the market for table tennis balls, etc., etc. Whereas if you looked at the race with your naked eye, you would be able to see how the race is moving in its collective form. That is, whether the players are all running fast or whether they are all running slow, who is leading, who is lagging, whether the distance between the different athletes is increasing or decreasing. So things like that are only possible to observe if you look at the race as a whole. And the example of this, we said, was when we study the macroeconomy or the study of macroeconomics, where we combine all the individual athletes, the individual players in the economy, and look at how the aggregates of those players, those concepts behave. If you remember, we mentioned the aggregation of agents and we mentioned the aggregation of concepts or variables. Now, in terms of the aggregation of agents, we said that you would combine all the households together and they would form the household sector. And your point of interest would change from any individual household or any individual consumer to the household sector as a whole. That is, you would now be interested in how consumer spending as a whole behaves. You're not interested on how a particular consumer conducts his consumption decisions, how much he spends on bananas, how much he spends on apples, how much he spends on durable goods, etc., etc. No. You're not even interested in how the whole of the household sector spends or views a particular product or a particular market. You might be more interested in how the overall spending profile of the overall household sector evolves over time and how it relates to other variables. We gave the example of aggregation of individual firms into the business sector. And then, of course, we had the government. On the aggregation of concepts, we saw that we earlier discussed prices and equilibrium quantities of individual markets, like the market for grain. We saw what price would clear the market, what would be the quantity where demand and supply would be equal, that is the equilibrium quantity in the market for grain. But when we are talking about macroeconomics, these individual prices are aggregated or combined together into a general price level in the economy. And that is usually represented by a retail price index or a consumer price index. And we'll see how exactly that is made sooner rather than later. We also looked at the aggregation of individual markets. For example, earlier we saw the market, how an individual laborer made his decisions about labor supply and how an individual firm made its decision about how much labor to hire. But in macroeconomics, we were more interested in the overall labor market, what was happening in the labor market as a whole, whether there was unemployment, underemployment, or overemployment. Overemployment was not possible, but one case of overemployment would be where laborers are hired over time. So these were the foundations that we developed. Then we saw or analyzed the question as to whether the aggregate variables that we had talked about, that is aggregate prices, we also talked about aggregate output, aggregate employment, whether these variables were related with each other and whether these variables had a life of their own. That is, whether they had any meaning which was more than just the fact that they were aggregates of individual markets and individual agents. So, was a life to macroeconomics separately identifiable? This was the question that we posed. And the answer to that was that before the 1940s or the 1930s, economists generally believed that there wasn't. Like macroeconomic variables did not need to be studied individually. They were not of interest. Economists were interested in microeconomics only, that is, how individual markets behave. However, this changed in the 1920s and 1930s with the Keynesian revolution, which introduced macroeconomics and the need to study macroeconomic variables in its own right. And since the 1940s, therefore, macroeconomics has been taught in schools, colleges, and universities. Now, the key issues that we identified in this debate between the classical economists and the Keynesian economists was one related to the faith in the market. The classical economists reposed a lot of faith in the market. They said that the market mechanism is the best. They believed in perfectly competitive markets, so they believed in dismantling monopolies. But more importantly, they believed in the assumptions of the perfectly competitive market. That was perfect information, that all firms were price takers, etc., etc. Now, the particular assumption about perfect information is what came under attack through the Great Depression debate between Keynes and the classical economists. Whereas the classical economists thought that the market mechanism, which was based on the perfect information assumption, would work automatically to remove any shortages or surpluses to produce an equilibrium which aligned with the full employment level of output. That is, an equilibrium in which you were on the production possibilities frontier. You were not inside it. That is, there was no slack or excess capacity in the economy. That is, resources were fully employed. So the classical economists believed in the market mechanism and its ability to produce the full employment level of output in the long run, or even in the short run, with only minor fluctuations happening here and there. Keynes, however, believed that it was possible for the market to settle at an equilibrium level of output which was less than the full employment level. That is, it was possible for the economy to become stable inside the production possibilities frontier, not necessarily on the production possibilities frontier. And this was one of the major points of disagreement which emerged. Keynes's insight was linked closely to the prevalent macroeconomic conditions in Western Europe and North America. The problem we studied in our last lecture was that unemployment had risen to very high levels, 25% unemployment. These were the rates that were being witnessed in North America and Western Europe. And classical economists could not provide advice or solutions to removing this problem. The only solutions that they could give were to enable the markets to work more smoothly than they already were, and to remove some of the frictions or some of the impediments to the working of the free market. And those impediments were that you should remove unemployment benefits to workers, which permits workers to stay at home and not offer themselves to work. You should have more wage flexibility so that workers should be willing to lower their wages, which would be in their own interest. So this is the kind of arguments that classical economists believe, because from their point of view, the whole problem was that the market mechanism was not working perfectly. And the reason it was not working perfectly was the fault of non-market intervention, that is, government intervening, trade unions intervening, etc., etc. If there was a surplus of labor in the labor market, then the ideal thing to do would be to let the labor market clear in a way so that the wage rate would fall and the demand for labor by firms would increase, and this would take the economy back to the full employment level. This was broadly the classical economist's position. Keynes's insight was predicated on his unique belief about how uncertainty affected this whole game. He said that we were not living in a world where people had perfect information. People faced a lot of uncertainty. And in particular, he highlighted the uncertainty that firms faced, businesses faced in making investment decisions. As you know, investment demand was an important part of the aggregate demand concept that we developed. Goods and services can either be demanded or wanted by consumers or the household sector. They can either be demanded by firms, that is businesses, or they can be demanded by the government. So Keynes paid a lot of attention to how the investment sector, that is the firms or businesses, viewed or had expectations about the future and how that affected their demand for labor in the short run or in the long run. That was the key difference. And Keynes's insight was that when expectations are static, and this, he said, could happen when there is uncertainty. That is, when expectations are static, and if you are stuck with a situation in which you have a recession or a depression, then there is no way to break out of those expectations. You can't expect the economy or the economic agents to break out of those expectations and suddenly bring the economy or take the economy to the full employment level. The key argument that Keynes made was that it is possible for the markets, the individual markets, to be working perfectly. Yet, if we do not pay sufficient attention to expectations and how they are playing out in the situation, then we might be prescribing policies which only make the situation worse. Today, before I dwell on the failures of Keynesian economics and how it saw a decline after the 1940s, certainly the 1940s, the late 1930s were the high point in Keynesian economics. Before I do that, I want to bring out some of the distinctions, some of the differences between classical and Keynesian economics in a little bit more clarity. This was not my original intention, but after the previous lecture, I thought it would be useful for you to understand the full dimensions of the debate between classical economists and Keynesian economics, because everything, virtually everything that we discuss later on would be predicated or based on what we believe about how the economy works, that is, whether it works under classical assumptions or Keynesian assumptions. Now, today we will look at three particular ways in which Keynesian views about the macroeconomy differed from the classical's views. We'll discuss the labor market in a little bit more detail. We'll see how involuntary unemployment can occur in a Keynesian world, whereas it cannot in a classical world. We mentioned this in the first lecture, but I think it is important to bring it out in a little bit more detail. We'll talk about the market for loanable funds, that is the market for where firms go out and look for funds which they can then use to invest in plants or machinery and invest in the production of new goods, a new quantity of goods and services. So we'll look at the market for loanable funds. And finally, we'll look at aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and how Keynesian and classical notions about these concepts are very different. So this is basically the three main differences that we will talk about in our lecture of today. Now, in understanding the labor market, let's take a look at what the classical position was. The classical position simply was that if there is an excess of labor in the market, that is, if labor supply is greater than labor demand, that is, if more people are willing to offer themselves for work than are firms willing to hire them, then in this position, the market mechanism would cause the price of labor to fall, that is, the wage rate to fall, and it would fall to a sufficient degree so that labor demand is again bid up and gradually the surplus is removed. That is, as the wage rate falls, firms will find that the labor becomes cheaper, and then their demand for labor will pick up. This was the classical position. However, Keynes' position was different. Keynes said that once you increase, or once there is an excess in the labor market and there is a pressure on the wage rate to fall, then firms look at that pressure on the wage rate, falling wage rate, in a negative way. They think that the people who are going to buy our products, that is, the very laborers whose wages are falling, the people who are going to buy our products are becoming poorer because they will be earning less and less if the wage rate is falling. And therefore, firms will have no incentive to invest in the production of new goods and services. And therefore, the investment demand for labor will never materialize. That is, you will never have a situation in which the labor market clears. When you say the labor market clears, you're basically saying that you are at the full employment level. That is, labor supply is equal to labor demand. Let us illustrate these two contrasting positions diagrammatically or graphically. We love graphs, and everything that could be explained through graphs in microeconomics, virtually everything can be explained through graphs in macroeconomics as well. So let's look at our graphs to help illustrate the difference in the position of classical economists and Keynesian economists on this important issue of unemployment in the labor market. Let's go to our slide. Now here is a diagram for the equilibrium in the labor market. You have the supply curve for labor and the demand curve for labor. This is for the aggregate market, the overall labor market. The supply of labor comes from individual laborers offering their services, whereas the demand for labor comes from firms who hire labor in order to produce goods and services. Now, consider an initial negative demand shock, which takes the demand curve for labor from DL to DL prime. And I've indicated or shown this shock as 1. So this is what happens first. And in this case, we simply assume that this was caused by the Great Depression. That is, once the Great Depression happened or the stock market crashed in New York, this had a negative effect on business confidence, and therefore it pushed the demand curve to the left, the demand curve for labor. Now, the important thing to note here was what was the insight that classical economists gave on how the situation would correct itself. That is, how would you move from the new equilibrium that was produced at Q prime back to the old or full employment equilibrium at Q. Note that at the full employment equilibrium of Q, you have labor, the clearing quantity of labor as L star. And L star here shows the full employment level. This is the level where everyone who offers him or herself for work is given a job. Now, the argument of classical economists was that if the market mechanism could be allowed to work freely, then wages would fall from W star to W prime, right? And this would then cause the demand for labor to rise again, and therefore DL prime would go back to DL and equilibrium would be established at Q again. So we move from Q to Q prime, and so in order to get back from Q prime to Q, we needed to ensure that wages fell to W prime fully, right? So it was clear, if the labor market was to clear, that is, if full employment equilibrium had to be reached again at Q, then you had to first allow wages to fall to W prime. However, classical economists saw the main problem at exactly this point. They said that although the demand for labor had fallen from DL to DL prime, the wage rate had not fallen commensurately or had not fallen to the desirable extent. And therefore, you were not able to get back to the previous full employment equilibrium. The reason they gave for why the wage rate had not fallen commensurately to W prime was that wages are sticky downwards. Sticky means something which कोई चीज जब चिपक जाती है और वो उससे हटती नहीं है, तो sticky wages basically means when wages get stuck to a level and do not fall below that level. So that is called sticky wages. So they said wages were sticky downwards. That is, workers were hesitant to accept lower wages. And obviously this is nothing out of this world. If you are working for a salary of 5,000 or 10,000 rupees per month, hopefully you'll be working for much more than that. But if you're working for that salary, let's say 10,000, and if you were offered to work for rupees 8,000 the next month, you would be hesitant to accept it, right? However, classical economists saw this as a vice. They said that this was not good for laborers themselves. If they allowed the wage rate to fall to rupees 8,000, let's say, then more of the laborers would be employed and the whole of the economy would be better off, and their wages would again rise to 10,000 rupees. And the reasons that classical economists gave for why the wage rate was not falling from, let's say, rupees 10,000 to rupees 8,000 was due to the existence of trade unions or labor unions. Labor unions, as you know, usually resist wage declines. They usually set some minimum wages or set a minimum level of wages below which wages do not sink. However, that's just one reason. Other reasons could be unemployment benefit, as I mentioned earlier. If people are given a cushion that they will get some money if they are not employed, then they might not offer themselves to work. That was another reason. So these were some of the reasons that classical economists gave for why the wage rate did not fall to the desired level. And the suggestions that they gave to government in order to rectify the situation was to reduce the influence of trade unions, to remove unemployment benefit, and remove the frictions that were preventing the wage rate to fall to the desired level. Now let's take a look at how Keynesian economics viewed the same situation. Let's go to our slide. Now Keynes said that fine, if the demand for labor had fallen from DL to DL prime, this would require a reduction in the wage rate from W star to W prime. However, he said that once wages fell from W star to W prime, what would the impact of this be on firms? Now he said that firms also viewed workers as consumers. For example, the wages that workers receive would be used as consumption expenditure on the goods and services that firms would produce. So when firms saw that workers would become progressively poorer, that is, their wage rate would fall, they had less incentive to produce more goods because they were more pessimistic that they would not be able to sell those goods because the people who are going to buy the goods are becoming poorer. Therefore, the firm's incentive to invest reduced, and this meant that the demand for labor, as you know, labor is an input into production. If firms do not want to produce more, then their demand for labor would also fall, right? So the demand curve for labor would further shift to the left in the move 3 from DL prime to DL double prime. And this meant that the earlier wage rate, W prime, which the classical economists had said would be able to clear the market, would now not be able to clear the market because wages would now have to fall to W double prime in order to take the economy back to Q. So with each reduction in wages or each new wage level, the demand curve for labor would continue to shift to the left. That is, as wages fell from W prime to W double prime, the demand for labor would fall from DL double prime to another demand curve, which would be DL triple prime. And so the level of employment in the market would fall from L star to L prime to L double prime to L triple prime. That is, the reduction in wages does not cause the economy to go back from L prime to L star or L double prime to L star or L triple prime to L star. It causes the economy to drift further and further away to the left from the point L star. And as you remember, L star is the level of full employment of labor in the economy. So as you move to the left, unemployment increases. And this is how Keynes explained the rising rate of unemployment during the Great Depression. Note, my friends, that in the classical version of the graph that we just saw, it was not possible for laborers to be voluntarily unemployed or involuntarily unemployed. Whereas in the Keynesian version of the graph, it was possible for workers to be involuntarily unemployed, that is, being unemployed against their wishes because of the impact of lower wages on investors' confidence, on firms' confidence, and firms' plans about future production. So this is how we illustrate one major difference between classical and Keynesian economists. Now, the implication or the recommendation that Keynes gave on how we could resolve the labor market problem will be given to you at the end. I mentioned it yesterday, that is, Keynes suggested that we need to inject demand in the economy, demand for goods and services, and this would help firms' confidence and help them invest or make that decision, change their expectations, and therefore induce them to demand more labor which they were presently or currently not demanding. But we will come to that after we discuss aggregate supply and aggregate demand in a little bit more detail. Before we do that, let's go to the second major point of departure between classical and Keynesian economics, and that happened in the loanable funds market. Now, this loanable funds market is far simpler than how difficult it sounds. The loanable funds market is simply the market for money in the economy. So, when you go and deposit money in a bank, you are a saver. That is, you save that money and you put it in the bank. And the bank pays you some interest rate, some rate of return, some rate of profit, right? Let's say that rate of profit is 4%. The bank then uses the money to invest or give that money to firms or businesses who then invest it in their projects and in their plants and machinery and in their production processes to produce goods and services which are then consumed in the economy. Now, the interest rate at which banks provide the loans to these investors, to these firms, is probably slightly higher than the 4% at which they got the money from you. So, the lending rate by banks is, let's say, 6%, whereas the deposit rate that the bank pays to you and me, the depositors, is, let's say, 4%, and 2% is the bank's profit. Now, assuming that this 2% did not exist, that is, if we leave alone this intermediation gap between 6% and 2%, this 6% and 4%, this gap that the banks charged as their margin, if we keep it aside and we just think of the interest rate as just one interest rate in the market, that is 5%. That is, you go to the bank, you get 5%, and then 5% is the rate at which banks lend to firms and businesses. Then that 5% becomes the market clearing interest rate. That is the interest rate which clears the market for loanable funds. Note that the depositors provide the supply of loanable funds, whereas the firms or businesses who want to borrow money and invest in plants and machinery generate the demand for loanable funds. Now, because you are very familiar and comfortable with demand and supply diagrams, I think we can directly take the plunge and see how equilibrium will be struck in the loanable funds market. Let's illustrate this through the use of a slide. So here we have the typical market for loanable funds, the typical upward sloping supply schedule, and the typical downward sloping demand schedule. It's the meaning of these demand and supply curves which is important, though. Note that the supply curve here is generated, the supply of loanable funds comes from savings or the deposits that depositors or individual households make into banks, whereas the demand for loanable funds comes from the demand for investment by firms or businesses who need cash, who need resources to invest and then produce goods and services. Now, the point of intersection of these two curves, the supply curve for loanable funds and the demand curve, gives you the equilibrium level of loanable funds. That is the quantity of loanable funds that would clear the market. And the important point here is not the quantity, rather the interest rate at which the quantity clears. That is the interest rate I star here. I star is the equilibrium interest rate, the interest rate at which the suppliers of loanable funds are willing to supply funds which are just enough to meet the demand of loanable funds, that is the demand by firms. So if the interest rate is, let's say, 5%, then at the margin the last depositor would pay would be willing to give or supply savings at a rate of 5%, whereas the last investor would be willing to borrow money at 5%. This is the concept of market clearing interest rate. Now, clearly, the market for loanable funds was an important factor or an important point of discussion in this whole debate on whether or how the economy should be taken out of this Great Depression, in the 1930s, that is. And so the classical economists said that the reason why firms were not investing was because the interest rate was too high. As you know, the interest rate is the cost of funds to the firm. When the firm gets money, that it borrows money to invest, then it has to pay an interest rate. And the higher the interest rate is, the less it will want to borrow the funds. And that is why the demand curve for funds in the loanable funds market was a downward sloping demand curve. That is, as the interest rates went up, the demand for loanable funds went down. And this was the classical economists' view on what was preventing firms from making free investments or making more investments. And they said if we could somehow bring the interest rate down, then we would be able to encourage firms from taking this leap, and we would encourage them to invest. How should the interest rate be brought down? Well, the classical economists' view was that we should increase savings. That is, consumers should save more out of their income. A person gets 100 rupees as his income. Now he can do two things with that money. He can either save it or he can consume it. If he saves 20 and consumes 80, then that 20 will be deposited in the bank, and that will form a part of the supply for loanable funds. So the argument that classical economists gave was that individual consumers should save more, provide more of these savings to the banking system or the financial markets as the supply of loanable funds. And once the supply of loanable funds increases, the interest rate will fall, and this will prompt firms to demand more loanable funds and therefore to invest more. And once they invest more, then their demand for labor, which is the input into production, the major input into production, will also increase, and this will solve the unemployment problem. Now, the Keynesian view was very different. The Keynesian view, again, highlighted the importance of the impact of an increase in savings on how firms viewed the potential that they had of selling the goods to consumers. Let's illustrate this through the use of a slide, both these contrasting views. Let's go to our slide. Now, classical economists, as I have just said, wanted the supply schedule in the loanable funds market to shift to the right, and this would be caused by an exogenous increase in savings. So the supply curve would shift from S0 to S1, and so this would cause the interest rate to go down from I0 to I1. And therefore, we would move along the demand curve from E0 to E1, and this would cause the equilibrium quantity in the loanable funds market to increase. That is the change 3 here. And therefore, investment would increase. This was the classical economist's view. Now, Keynes said that fine, you could shift the supply curve for loanable funds from S0 to S1, that is change 1. But when savings increase, the consumption of consumers falls, right? As I said, if you earn rupees 100 and you suddenly start saving more, that is, if you earlier saved rupees 20 and now you save rupees 30, then less will be available for you to consume. Less will be spent on the consumption of goods and services. So Keynes said that once one happened, that is the change from S0 to S1 happened, that only meant that consumers would reduce their consumption expenditure, their spending. And this meant that firms' demand for investment would fall. That is, the demand schedule for firms would shift to the right, because firms would now see that they would not be able to sell the products that they are producing, or that they would be producing, because consumers would be consuming less. They would be buying less goods and services. Therefore, you move from I0 to I1, but because the investment curve, that is the demand curve for loanable funds, has shifted to the left, the new market clearing interest rate would be I2. And therefore, even I1 would seem as too high an interest rate. Keynes's insight was that if you are in such a situation, then any interest rate, no matter how low it is, will be too high to clear the market. And therefore, you will be in a perpetual move in moving lower and lower interest rates, but investment would not be increased because of this problem of reduced consumption spending by consumers, which would be viewed by firms as reducing the potential of the firms selling the goods and services that they produce. So that was the difference of opinion that existed between classical and Keynesian economists on the issue of the loanable funds market and how we could use the loanable funds market to increase investment demand. Keynes gave a different insight, whereas classical economists gave a totally different insight. Keynes said increased savings would cause investment demand to fall, whereas classical economists said that increased savings would cause investment demand to rise. So there was again the opposite poles positions that the two schools had taken. Now, that was the loanable funds market. Now we come to perhaps the most important point of difference between the two schools, which relates to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply schedules, or aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. Now, you know the typical demand and supply curves in microeconomics. The demand curve, when drawn in PQ space, that is price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, the demand curve is a downward sloping line, whereas the supply curve is an upward sloping line. You know that. Now, in macroeconomics, when you collect all the demands and all the supply potential in the economy, and you plot the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, that is the global or collective demand and collective supply curves, you still get upward sloping supply curves, whereas downward sloping demand curves in PQ space. You again have the price level on the vertical axis and the quantity of goods and services on the horizontal axis, but this will be the total or gross domestic product on the horizontal axis. So the shape of the demand and supply curves are, at least at the starting level, not very different. We will see how the shape of the aggregate supply curve can be different depending on which school you belong to, which school of thought in economics do you belong to, whether you belong to the classical school or the Keynesian school. And we'll discuss those two. But let me begin by explaining to you how the aggregate demand schedule or aggregate demand curve is drawn and why it slopes like that. Now, the reason why the aggregate demand curve slopes like that is not as simple as the reason why the demand curve in microeconomics sloped downwards. If you remember, the law of demand stated that as the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded of that good falls. Now, when you're looking at the overall economy and you're talking about the price level prevailing in the economy and the total quantity of goods and services demanded by consumers, firms, households, businesses, government, foreign consumers, then things become a little bit more complicated. The demand curve, the aggregate demand curve that we now draw, captures the relationship between the quantity demanded by all these different sectors, households, firms combined, all these different sectors combined at different price levels. Now, the reason why this relationship is inverse, or why the demand curve slopes downward, is because of three effects. You have the interest rate effect, the wealth effect, and the international purchasing power effect. And these you can think of replace the income and substitution effects which we introduced in microeconomics as the reason why the demand curve slopes downward. There we had those two effects. Here we have these three effects. Now let me explain these effects to you in a little bit more detail. What is the interest rate effect? Now the interest rate effect simply says that the relationship between nominal interest rates, or you can say the nominal deposit rates or the nominal rates at which banks lend to businesses or firms, is proportional or increases with the inflation rate or with an increase in prices. So that means that if you have money deposited in a bank and the bank is paying you 5% interest rate, and if inflation suddenly goes up, that is if the rate of change of prices goes up, then you will become worried about the money that is lying with the bank, because you will feel that the money, the return that you get on your money should at least be enough to offset the loss in purchasing power which is being caused by the rate of increase in prices. You know, if things become more expensive, your purchasing power gets affected. You can buy less and less goods. Therefore, if you have money lying in the bank and the money is earning a return of 5% or 6%, but the inflation rate suddenly rises from, let's say, 2% to 3%, then you would also expect the deposit rate to increase by 1%. If the inflation rate rises by 3%, you would expect the deposit rate to go up by 3%. So there is an ipso facto relationship between the rate of increase in prices and the nominal interest rate. So when the nominal interest rate increases because of an increase in prices, what is the impact on interest-sensitive spending? Naturally, people who use or who have to pay the interest rate in order to use certain funds, and the natural sector here that should come to your mind is the business sector. It is the business sector which will be affected by a rise in the nominal interest rate, right? So when prices go up, nominal interest rates go up, and the people who have to pay that nominal interest rate as a cost of funds. I'm not talking about depositors here. Depositors are the ones who demand the higher interest rate. I'm talking about firms who have to pay the higher interest rate. They will reduce the level at which they consume loanable funds. That is, they will reduce their level of investment. They will reduce their demand for loanable funds because the cost of funds has increased. So when prices increase, the nominal interest rate goes up, and this has a negative effect on investment demand. And this is one part of the reason why the demand curve is downward sloping. That is, the relationship between demand and price is inverse. That's one. The second one is the wealth effect. That is, when prices increase, people suddenly feel poorer. They feel that their purchasing power has been eroded. I just mentioned it in the context of you as depositors. That is, if prices increase, you will demand a higher return on the funds that have been invested in the bank. But think of it more generally. If suddenly prices increase in the economy, you will feel worse off. You will feel poorer, right? So it will have a wealth effect. Your consumption will go down. You will feel poorer. You will be able to consume less goods. And this will have a direct effect on consumption demand. That is the other part of aggregate demand. We have investment demand that firms generate, and we have consumption demand that households and consumers generate. So as prices go up, people feel poorer and their consumption demand falls. This is a simple wealth effect. You can consider it equivalent in some ways to the income effect of a price rise in microeconomics. The third effect is the international purchasing power effect. And this is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Now think of your goods and services as being open for consumption to either local consumers or to foreign consumers. So your goods and services can either be purchased by people within the country or by people abroad, right? Now, if your goods and services become more expensive, that is, if prices rise, and that is what we mean by an increase in the price level or an increase in the inflation rate, that is, prices are rising fast, then what do you think will be the impact of people who are buying your goods from abroad, right? So if you are something that you produced cost rupees 100 and now suddenly it costs rupees 120, people who are buying your goods from, let's say, the US or UK will notice this change, and they will not want to buy your product at the higher price. They would rather shift to some other country. They'll shift to Korea or Taiwan or China or some other country, right? So this international purchasing power effect is the kind of substitution effect that applies to foreign buyers of your goods, that foreign buyers will substitute other countries' goods in place of the goods that they bought from your country. And this will affect the foreign demand for your goods and services. So we've talked about three demands. We've talked about investment demand, we've talked about consumption demand, and we've talked about foreign demand. And we've seen how an increase in prices causes all of these three demands to fall, right? And that establishes the negative relationship between aggregate demand and the price level. Now, whenever we talk about demand curves, we talk about shifts in the demand curve. And how is it possible for us to talk about the aggregate demand curve and not talk about the factors which cause shifts in the aggregate demand curve? Let me briefly enumerate the 4 factors which can cause shifts in the aggregate demand curve. I will not go into details because we are still trying to develop a broad understanding of the issues, but we might come to these in greater detail later. Now, the 4 factors which can cause shifts in the demand curve is 1, an increased or decreased willingness of consumers to spend. So if you suddenly have Eid time, then consumers might be willing to spend more, right? And that would cause a rightward shift in the demand curve. Another factor which could cause a shift in the demand curve could be change in business sentiment or business confidence. If the business sector suddenly feels more confident about the future potential and their ability to make profits in the future, they might increase their investments. They might take on more projects, right? And that might shift the aggregate demand curve to the right by boosting investment demand. A third factor which can cause the demand curve to shift is a change in foreign consumers' view or sentiments about your goods, right? So foreign consumers, if they suddenly develop a preference for your goods, or if, for example, there were some quota restrictions on your exports abroad to the EU or to the US, and if these quota restrictions are removed, then you would suddenly be able to export more. That is, the foreign demand for your goods and services would increase, and this would shift the demand curve to the right. The fourth and probably the most important factor in the context of the classical versus Keynesian discussion that causes the demand curve to shift is government spending. If the government spends more, that is, if it increases spending on different projects, on subsidies, on unemployment benefit, on welfare projects, on infrastructure projects, that will cause the demand curve to shift to the right. Similarly, if the government cuts its taxes, that's another way of shifting the demand curve to the right. Similarly, if the government increases its taxes, the demand curve would shift to the left. These are the 4 factors which cause shifts in the demand curve. When I say demand curve, I obviously mean the aggregate demand curve. And you should be able to infer it automatically because we are talking in the realm of macroeconomics. So, my friends, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've moved slowly, but we've still managed to cover quite a lot of different things. We started by looking at the 3 major markets or 3 major points on which classical and Keynesian economists differ. And I thought it would be useful for you to know what these 3 points were. And these become pretty important as you further develop an understanding of employment and inflation down the road. We looked at how Keynesian and classical economists differed about their intuition and advice regarding how the labor market problem of unemployment could be solved. We then looked at how the loanable funds market was also an area where classical economists and Keynesian economists offered opposite advice or opposite intuition. We then started our discussion about aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. We looked at the reasons why the aggregate demand curve was downward sloping. Some of those reasons were the interest rate effect, the wealth effect, and the international purchasing power effect. We also looked at factors which caused the aggregate demand curve to shift either to the left or to the right. In our next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the aggregate supply schedule and present it as the major point of contention between Keynes and the classical economists. We'll look at the law that Keynes gave, which was the direct opposite law of the French classical economist J.B. Say, which was that supply creates its own demand. Keynes said demand creates its own supply, and we'll see exactly what this means once we've developed an understanding of the aggregate supply curve. Once we've completed that discussion, we will see what were the factors which led to the decline of Keynesian economics. We will start by discussing the Keynesian recommendations, whether they were taken on board or rejected, and then we will look at what happened to Keynesian economics in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and if we get time, find time, we will be able to discuss where we stand today. So, my dear students, with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. I have deliberately tried to go slow and tried to repeat some of the things that I said in the first lecture in order to make sure that the concepts that I was imparting were duly cemented in your minds. It's very important for you to review these concepts. So go home and look at the examples, the definitions, the curves, how they are drawn, what are the reasons for why the aggregate demand curve shifts or slopes downwards, what are the factors that cause shifts in these, things like that. Go home, review them. Review the interrelationships between some of these variables. Think about how consumers are at the same time laborers and how they are at the same time demanders of goods and services. This is the kind of intuition that you should develop if you want a successful attempt at macroeconomics. So till our next lecture, with that advice, I'll leave you with Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.